Yeah, I get a lot of media requests, and of course, Turning Point's big without this book. So I try to mention the book when I get interviewed. But
Yeah.
yeah, a lot of people interested in
Okay. So we're
talking about
going live, and the first thing I want to say before I introduce you properly is your book. Hold it up, show the cover, read the title and subtitle.
The Seven Mountains Mandate: Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy.
Okay, and just hold it up and show us the cover one more time because I unfortunately read it as a file. And we are making this our book club offering in July. We have a book club called It Has to Be Read. It is our July offering
Okay.
for anybody interested once we have done this podcast. So I will introduce you properly, but first I want to say thank you for coming back. When we canceled your appearance the first time, it was because your book has quite a bit about Charlie Kirk in it. And we were about to interview you either on the day of or the day after his assassination, and it was too on the nose for us. We're not a clickbaity outfit. Most people would rush to that and say, "Oh, great, we'll do this," but that's not what we do. Um, we try to avoid that. So now enough time has passed, and of course, your book is not about that. It's a much bigger subject. Um, and my family figures very heavily in it. I checked Francis Schaeffer went through it, and his name is probably in there about as much as anybody's besides Rusesh Rushdoony and a few other people. So to say that I'm connected to this book is an understatement,
Yes.
because not only is my dad in it a lot, but of course you cite some of his books and film series and other things that wouldn't have happened unless I had become his nepotistic sidekick and produced first How Should We Then Live as a film series with a book that he wrote. And then secondly, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, featuring Dr. Sierra Koop, who then became Surgeon General under Ronald Reagan. So my fingerprints are not on your book, but they're on the history that we are going to be talking about and then where it went. So
I did read some of your stuff as well for the book.
thank you. Thank you. Good. I appreciate that. And I continue to write and comment. And of course, I guess for listeners to this who don't know you and me, they're going to get to know you well while we talk about the book. And my history, which most people who listen to my stuff already know, but there's a thumbnail that actually is important here because it sets up your book, is that I was raised very much in the environment of the religious movement that produced first the religious right and now the Christian nationalist movement, who then doubles back and uses my father's work as a foundation for what they're doing. Often, I may add, illegitimately, in the sense that he would not like the direction things are taking now.
Mhm.
And it would be very contrary to his vision. Now, you can blame him and blame me for not foreseeing where this could go, especially books like his A Christian Manifesto that called for the overthrow of the US government unless Roe v. Wade was reversed using legitimate legal means, which it has been, by the way. It didn't take a revolution to do that. The Supreme Court did it with the Trump nominees and the rest. But that said, of course, I take this all very personally and feel a great deal of regret in discussing this information because the first part of my life as a young sidekick assistant director of my father's stuff. In my late teens, believe it or not, only in the evangelical world can you either be a preacher and or an evangelical leader when you're 18, but such as our weird subculture. And then I was out by the time I was about 30,
Mhm.
and now I'm 73. So a lot of time has passed, and my own farewell letter, as it were, to that movement, published in 1990, was a novel that became very successful called Portofino, which evangelicals, the few who read it, hated because they felt it was mocking the movement out of which I'd come. It's a work of humor. Other people thought it was very gentle. But then more recently, I wrote a memoir called Crazy for God, which really traces my family's history in this movement from my point of view, from young childhood all the way through into the 70s and 80s and beyond when I left. So I don't usually start with a preamble like that, but in this case, it's kind of a good introduction to our subject. So let me first begin by saying it's a really good book. I was a fly on the wall for just about everything you're writing about, directly or indirectly. I stayed in Rusesh Rushdoony's house for 3 days. I knew him well. I obviously grew up in the Schaeffer household. I know all the Christian leaders of the 70s and 80s that you talk about. I worked with them. And the first thing I want to do is just commend you and say, when you're reading a book, say, set in a town in which you grew up, you're going to judge it harshly because it's like,
Mhm.
I actually know the area.
Right.
You really nailed it accurately. There's
Mhm.
nothing in your book that I would red flag and say, whoa, wait a minute, I was there and it wasn't like this. You really got it. So the first thing I want to do as a kind of an eyewitness to this part of history, or at least the early stages of it, just tell my listeners and viewers that if they want to read a book to understand where the religious right and thus the Christian nationalist movement, and thus Charlie Kirk, and thus, say, to these days, J.D. Vance, and
Mhm.
all the people cashing in on this came from, they're not going to understand it until they read your book. So, first
Mhm.
of all, hold it up again, give us the title and subtitle. And let me just say, if I could give this 5 stars out of 5, that's what your book would get in veracity, writing, and all the rest of it. It's a very important book. So let me start by asking you about your personal life and background to give us a context. Who are you? What do you do? And why did you write this book? And when did you start working on it? It's a long history. At some point, this became a project for you. Give us a little bit of that, and then we'll get into
Yeah.
what you say.
Sure. I'm a professor of English here at the University of North Georgia, and my I don't know research agenda is religious rhetoric. And so I've written a book about evil and some other things, and I've been writing about Turning Point for several years now, mainly because they targeted me with their famous professor watch list. But at the same time, as I was writing about Turning Point, I noticed this change that was going on in their organization. They moved from conservative policy group to a Christian nationalism group. And that
Yeah.
fell right into my wheelhouse, both because I write about it, but also I lived it. I grew up in the 90s as an evangelical. I don't use that term for myself anymore. But in the 90s, in evangelicals, we're all reading our Francis Schaeffer and we're all talking about how change culture. And when Charlie Kirk and Turning Point switched to this idea of Christian nationalism, specifically the Seven Mountains Mandate, I recognized it right away because I had
Mm.
also heard of theonomy and theocracy and R.J. Restuni before that. And so I wanted to write about what Charlie was saying because it has echoes to the past, but also Turning Point itself is a very powerful organization now. It wasn't in the beginning. And I think that as a professor, I tried to do an academic look at it, but I also understood that as a citizen, as a person experiencing the effects of this, being targeted, but also living in the South and being an evangelical, I tried to identify, what it means for the rest of us. I mean, these people could think what they want, believe what they want, but now they're trying to take over the country. So
Yeah.
it kind of fell both personally and professionally in areas. And when those two things meet, it's hard to ignore. So I began writing the book after doing several profiles on Turning Point and doing some podcasts in 2024. So basically, the book was written in 2024. As you can see, I wrote a preface about the election.
Sure.
I had two written, one of Trump won and one of the other party won. So by the time the election happened, the book was kind of over. And so 2024 became a big part of why Turning Point's important. But really, what I wanted to focus on, of course, is the seven mountains. Each of these areas of our culture that are trying to be taken over by this group or by this ideology. And
Sure.
Charlie Kirk is the heir to all the things you just laid out in your introduction.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of the Project 2025, and then also J.D. Vance's sort of checklist of what he wants to do to colleges and universities and teaching of American history very much follow this. So let me just start with a little footnote that, of course, means something to me. And that is that, I had never heard of the Seven Mountains at all as Francis Schaeffer's son, because he never used that term.
Right. Yeah.
He
Mhm.
never did this. So the first thing to say is that while a lot of people credit him as the kind of intellectual force behind the idea, let's retake our culture. He famously used to say things when he'd speak at law schools at places like Oral Roberts University. It's time, forget being a missionary, be a lawyer so that you can be a judge, change the things from the inside. And of course, his message on arts and literature and music were the same. And so in the 70s, we were gathering all these people who came from the Christian music business and others who were very pleased to finally meet someone in evangelicalism that took culture seriously, that took art
Sure.
seriously. The difference between Dad and Charlie Kirk was that, or J.D. Vance, was that Dad actually enjoyed art for art's sake. He thought,
Right.
he went to the Uffizi Museum in Florence numerous times because he loved Botticelli, not to learn about Botticelli so then we could do a quote Christian version and get people either saved. The difference is back in Dad's day, a lot of it was divided between getting people saved still. In other words,
Right.
put the gospel message into music, whatever it
Yeah.
may be. These days, it's all political.
Right, right.
It's not about saving anybody's souls. It's about winning elections. So talk a little bit about Dad, how this happened, the difference between him for people who know me and my
Yeah.
family, where they're going now.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize that with your dad and the other people early on, I do think it was about influencing culture, whereas now it is about domination or dominion or taking over. And the change happened for me in the history that I lay out. I think when they started to emphasize spiritual warfare in the 2000s, and that's when
Sure.
Lance Wallnau met Lauren Cunningham and got this list from him. And as you said, you never heard of it because the phrase wasn't used. I'd never heard of this particular phrase until writing this book. Like I
Right.
knew all the other things you knew, and reading is like the seven mountains was this kind of fringe idea until Lance Wallnau made it really big,
Yeah.
in the 2000s after meeting Lauren Cunningham. I think that the difference between the early fathers, or if you will, the original generation of that was about influence. They were interested in taking a Christian culture and making that, but they wanted to use persuasion or arguments, or again, making a Christian music artist. Whereas now it is a little bit about Trumpian taking the fight to you, overtaking our culture. It is
Yeah.
not about persuasion. It's about we are going to take this back, no matter what it takes. And sometimes it takes anti-democratic ways to do that. So I do think there's a difference between the two, which is kind of ironic to me because with the central character in the book being Charlie Kirk, was seen as this debater, as this arguer, as this persuasion person, but he was
Yeah.
laying the part of the idea of this spiritual warfare was also there, that they would just take it back. And you could
Well,
hear
what's
that.
interesting is, and I want to get your take on this, it seems to me we've gone to even a new step, which isn't specific to your book, but the old argument was take it back because this used to be a Christian country. And
Mhm.
now it's sort of more like, I guess you use the analogy that Trump is going to arrest all the murderers and rapists who were born outside of the US and were here illegally. But now he's just arresting anybody with a
Yeah.
brown skin. Well, there's a similar thing here. It's not about taking it back anymore. It's like, well, whether we were that or not, we're
Mhm.
going to move into a future that we control,
Right.
period.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that was Charlie's idea as well, that he didn't really use seven mountains as a phrase because he understood the baggage that came with it. He wanted to talk about the future and being a Christian nation. I think that shows up in Trump administration policies. They're about building perhaps an anti-democratic future with Trump at the helm. Yeah,
Well, it
definitely.
would have to be an anti-democratic future because if the vote was counted, Americans are not all white Christian nationalists and would
Right.
not be voting for this. So it would have to end run the system and
Mhm.
impose it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's why I emphasize in the book and in many other places that the Seven Mountains is a minority movement on purpose. It is
Yeah.
about taking a minority of Christians, a minority of Protestant Christians, and putting them in power, and the rest of us sort of have to go, not just go along with it, but are somehow shamed or silenced into not fighting back. So it's a minority movement, an anti-democratic movement. Yeah,
Well, and counting on the apathy of the majority, or in these days of ICE roaming the streets fully armed in masks and sunglasses, the terror of the majority who don't want to
right.
confront these stormtroopers in some context, be that in our airports now that they've been put there or somewhere else. There's an element of force here that has never existed before as a legal framework since the Civil War. I mean, there's been, the Ku Klux Klan and others roaming neighborhoods and doing things to people, but it hasn't been the federal government.
Yeah, yeah, and I think this is what Trump has changed the Seven Mountains. Of course, the people that he put himself surrounded with, the first administration and now the second administration, this evangelical advisory board, many of them are Seven Mountains Christian nationalist person, but then giving him the power to be the divine-like figure, he's taking that to a new extreme.
Yeah,
Some of these
including
people,
people putting people like you on lists and attacking universities. I had an interesting case about which I know something personally, just to look at this progression. And I haven't talked about this person before publicly, but there was a worker in L'Abri who became a best-selling Christian author called Os Guinness back in
yeah,
the 70s. Okay, now Oz in the 70s was to the left and he was against our anti-abortion films. He said, this isn't
mhm,
an evangelical issue. Why would you do that? He was against the Vietnam War. He was very close to some of the students who came through that were from leftist groups,
mhm.
et cetera, et cetera. Well, he's moved,
Oh yes,
to the point where he opened for Trump at the convention in Washington, before the
yeah,
last election, saying that we were now dealing with demonic issues, that the
mhm,
left and the Democrats and anybody who didn't vote for Trump were basically on the side of a you know, a demon
Yeah.
inspired warfare. Well, of course, this is the same thing that Tucker Carlson has gotten into.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then
No.
weirdly, Peter Thiel with his talk about, well, if you're not for
Right.
technology and what I'm doing. So all of these guys are trying to use the terminology of spirituality that someone
Mhm.
like, Paula White would be familiar with,
Right.
and put it in service of keeping their guy in power or getting him elected. And of course, J.D. Vance is doing this with his conversion to the Roman Catholic Church, and then talking about, ICE agents who shoot people in the face have absolute immunity. But anywhere you look at this, and so Oz was an
Mhm.
interesting example
Yeah.
because here you had a member of the evangelical left moving to the right because that's where both the money and the power is, and
Mhm.
basically almost a kind of an example of a whole movement in one man. And he's in his late 70s
Yeah,
now.
and I think
But
he's a good example too because I knew him growing up in the '90s as this apologetics guy. So his
yeah,
idea was trying to argue and persuade people, but now not so much. Yeah.
yeah, he was sort of a higher class, more educated
Mhm.
McDowell type of guy, talking
Mhm.
about the arguments. But my view was, well, wow, if you can politicize him and basically get him into this Seven Mountains thing, and then give him put in his mouth the words that this is spiritual warfare against demonic oppression, as
Right.
Democrats are people who wouldn't vote. You're really in the end game there.
No, yeah, yeah. Talk about the spiritual warfare. What to me became clear in writing the book was we think of spiritual warfare. It's in the Bible. It's about wearing your breastplates of righteousness. It's about individual, like battling the devil over your
Right,
own sin, perhaps. But now they've nationalized it. Now it's become the nation, good versus evil. Democrats are on one side,
right.
Republicans on another. So they've politicized it and nationalized it.
Yeah, and then of course at the same time, and then we'll get into your book, covering up this level of gross hypocrisy where their guy is a thrice married adulterer accused of raping a 13-year-old, and somehow that's okay, but you're on a list as an enemy, as a professor who takes a different point of view on
Mm.
politics. This is a very weird world, because back in the day when Dad was a big figure, Billy Graham or even Jerry Falwell, at least they paid lip service to virtue through their hypocrisy. In other words,
Mm.
you didn't just accept adultery and abuse of women, or as
Right.
Trump put it, I grabbed them by the pussy. This wasn't part of our world. You were out. You had to
Right.
repent and say you would never do this
Yeah.
again. And now, a figure like Os Guinness is out there saying that we're on a demonic side, and his guy is credibly accused of rape. It's a very topsy-turvy world.
Yeah, and this is the idea that Lance Wallnau's promoted is that Trump is this divine figure and that he can't do no wrong. There are plenty of people that have said the things that you've listed in other contexts and have been demoted or canceled, but Trump is the lone figure who never faces any responsibility.
Okay, so when we got going, hey, did I properly introduce you? Because if not, this is a good time to reintroduce you. I'm afraid I dove right in here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today is Matthew Boedy, writer. Matthew is a writer, professor, and media commentator whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other major outlets, with appearances on CNN and MSNBC. He is a full professor of rhetoric at the University of North Georgia, where he researches religious rhetoric with a focus on the rise of Christian nationalism. He is the author of The Seven Mountains Mandate, hold the book up, exposing the dangerous plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I'm going to ask you to please subscribe right now on YouTube, where you're watching this live, or if you're watching a recording, and to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, where our programs all become podcasts, and to my Substack page, it has to be said, at frankschaeffer.substack.com, where all my um, everything appears first to the Substack subscribers. So please subscribe there. You can follow my new project at thegospelofzip.com, which is my new book that I read out loud and is online for free on YouTube. About 7,000 people have watched all 8 hours so far. Thank you so much. You can also support our work by making tax-deductible donations at georgebailey.org, and they are much appreciated. So let's get back now to the passage that I asked you to read. And I'd like you to set it up, because there's people like Cunningham and others you're mentioning.
Yeah.
Talk about the cast of characters here that are going to be in this passage a little bit, set it up, and then read it for us. It's a long passage, but it both sets up the involvement of my father in this project, as it were, talks about Cunningham and others. So please introduce us to who you're going to be talking about. Tell us where this is in the book, and then have at it.
So this comes in the introduction as I lay out the history and the origins of the Seven Mountains Mandate. And as you point out, Lauren Cunningham, who founded a group called Youth with a Mission, who died a couple of years ago, he and Bill Bright, who was the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, known as Cru now, they met in August 1975 in Colorado, and each claimed that God had given them this list of these 7 areas that they wanted to take back for Jesus. Now, this list is not necessarily divinely endorsed. You could have found textbooks and places. You could have guessed what these institutions are. But after that meeting, both people put into practice or tried to apply this institutional list. Lauren Cunningham made it a central part of his ministry for 30 years. And then Bill Bright, over the years in 75 and the 80s, got more political and started to train people in this area. So in the book, we learn about Lauren and Bill Bright's meeting, but we also learn about a third person. Along with Bright and Cunningham, there's often a third person associated with the legend of that 1975 meeting. In Cunningham's rendition of that meeting, he notes a month later, his wife, Darlene, saw on TV, and other times he said he was listening to a radio show, one of the most well-known Christian apologists of the 20th century, Francis Schaeffer, offered the same list of 7 areas of cultural influence. Like Bright and Cunningham, Schaeffer was also known to minister to a youth-oriented crowd. In 1955, he founded L'Abri, the Swiss-based community for seekers, skeptics, and others, usually young, who wanted answers about God. Quote, a drop-by haven for intellectual curious evangelicals, the New York Times called it in a 2011 profile of Frank Schaeffer's son. L'Abri meeting houses would eventually spread globally, and millions would read the elder Schaeffer's books. His cultural engagement inspired many preachers to engage in politics, including Jerry Falwell, who would go on to found the Moral Majority in 1979. In the 60s, Falwell set against the mingling of politics and preachers, specifically criticizing Martin Luther King Jr. and his March in Selma. Schaeffer helped Falwell and his fellow conservative Christians see a broader goal beyond simply sharing the gospel. His work emphasized more systemic issues with modern America, including abortion. He called for a return to the Christian foundations he saw at the origins of the United States and more broadly Western civilization, by providing a history of how those origins had been abandoned. Schaeffer was also influential on Cunningham and Bill Bright. In 1968, Schaeffer led a training event for Youth with a Mission in Switzerland, where Cunningham started his first school for evangelism. Darlene Cunningham credits Schaeffer with convincing her and her husband Lauren about the importance of the Lordship of Christ over elements of culture. And during a trip to Europe in 1971 to celebrate the 20th anniversary of his organization, Bill Bright arranged a special meeting for his son with Francis Schaeffer. And more than a decade later, Bill Bright called Schaeffer one of the greatest men of our times. As Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham met in Colorado in August 75, Schaeffer and his wife were on a European film shoot for his tandem book and movie project, How Should We Then Live? That book, including analysis of the kind of topics on the list that Cunningham and Bright had given each other. How Shall We Then Live was a sweeping intellectual history of the impact of culture, from science to art to music to philosophy to capitalism to politics, on Christianity and its followers since its origin. In a previous book, Schaeffer had outlined the line of despair, the point at which a cohesive or a unified answer to the acclamation of cultural knowledge was untenable, and so the world drifts into a secular, even nihilistic hopelessness. That certainly laid the ground for fears of a satanic or demonic rule of the world that Cunningham and Bright shared. The book and the movie narrated by Schaeffer became a sensation in American evangelicalism, according to historian Daniel K. Williams. He wrote, conservative evangelicals have been looking for an explanation for the secular drift of their country, and Schaeffer's diagnosis of contemporary cultural errors gave them a framework for understanding it, and the impact was clear. Evangelicals now understood there was a culture war taking place in America, and they were determined to become active participants in it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, because that passage not only sets up your book and our topic today, but it is a very sort of, aside from, it talks about my father and then the movies that I produced and directed for him, How Should We Then Live, and then Whatever Happened to the Human Race, also talks about the fact that the origin of this movement was not the movement as it is today. They are standing on the shoulders, if not of giants, of certainly another generation who would not have foreseen Donald Trump
Hmm.
I knew Bill Bright personally. I knew, obviously, my dad very well. That generation of evangelicals still had manners. They still believed that there was something, as my father would call, true truth. So the
Very good.
idea of moving into a post-truth era where you can say you're negotiating with the Iranians when you're not, when hiding up the Epstein files, this is not the territory they operated in.
Hmm.
And so first, talk a little bit about the shift in the movement that my dad was so much a part of the beginning of to where we are today, not just in the political aims of people like J.D. Vance and the naked
Yeah.
political power grab they're undertaking, but the shift in what I'll call the decline of civility, decline of
Hmm.
manners, decline of any commitment at all to the truth. So, like
Hmm.
Charlie Kirk, my father believed in discussion. You could go
Yeah.
to Labrie and argue with him, and he wouldn't slap you up the side of the head or throw you out. You could have an alternative position. He didn't cast you as an enemy. In those days, Os Guinness would argue with anybody and talk to people. He didn't say he was in demonic warfare and that any opponent of his was evil. Talk a little bit about just that, and then we'll get into Rushdoony and the others. What changed in the tone?
I think what changed in the tone was two things. One, you kind of mentioned it before, this kind of civility they thought turned into political correctness. They thought that you said something in the public, that you said something in private differently, that you were lying, right?
Sure.
And I think that they were tired of managing multiple profiles of public and private, that their politicians always lied to them. And so sometimes they would fake it. I think evangelicals became upset at that. And I think the second thing for me, growing up in the '90s, was this idea that you were constantly losing. There were
Mhm.
some victories along the way, but it took years for Roe v. Wade to be overturned. But they were constantly losing political battles, and they didn't want to lose anymore. So it became instead of retreating into our Christian culture and perhaps being polite with others, even though you hated them in the background, you were then going to be more, I don't know if the word's authentic to describe Donald Trump, but he is who he is. He lies
Sure.
all the time, but at the same time, he said previous presidents, both Democrat and Republican, were civil in public, but him in private. And I think that's what the idea of changed over time, that Christians and evangelicals did not want to do this kind of civility, did not want to be nice or to take it on the cheek. Or I've seen people write about that, turning that around in the exact opposite of what it meant. But I also think that in terms of Charlie Kirk and debate, what Charlie Kirk does is completely different than what your father or Os Guinness did. It's not a debate. He started these prove me wrong tables. He's never proven wrong. He always wins because he sets it up in a way that he's not interested in changing his mind. So he
Sure.
comes across as a debater, and he comes across as someone who is politely aggressive, but he never loses. And I think that's the difference between the Seven Mountains Mandate group and the group your father was in, was that they were willing to change their mind, or they're willing
Yeah,
to
and
be
even once in a while in a discussion to say, "Hey, I stand corrected. I was wrong. I've
right. Yeah.
learned something." I mean, Dad would famously do that, and that
Mhm.
level of humility actually was one of the reasons he appealed to so many young people because they
Right.
didn't
Yeah. Yeah.
find him
Yeah.
in that arrogant role.
And you think about why young people are attracted to Charlie Kirk. It isn't about the humility part, even though you may say he has some. It is about this aggressiveness, this taking back the culture, going to places where they're not
Sure.
wanted. That's what they cheer for. They would not cheer for that for your father.
Well, similarly, you can only imagine what the profile is of the people watching Pete Hegseth's videos set to rock music of our wartime efforts.
Yeah.
Whoever that impresses obviously are idiots. And,
Yeah.
having had a son fight in the Marine Corps for 5 years in and out of Afghanistan and Iraq, they give me no pleasure because they don't take seriously the most serious actions of our government, which is warfare.
Mhm.
Nobody who's had a child go to war wants to see them going in a rock video
Or video games. Yeah. They've
or
inflated.
video games. I mean,
Yeah.
and the arrogance and the hubris of this whole crew, Hegseth, Os Guinness, Charlie Kirk, they all have this kind of hubristic male, weird, manosphere, twisted. I mean, Elon Musk with all his followers,
Mhm.
um, it's all the same thing. So, Grok is called out with AI changing people's photographs into nude porn, and he just laughs at it.
Mhm.
Um, so again, before we get too deep into the book itself and the structure, I just want your wisdom on what has happened to the male cohort
Yeah.
when it comes to not just civility, but to use a very old-fashioned word, any idea of chivalry or appropriate behavior to women.
Yeah, I think that there's this, again, Trumpian idea of fighting back or fighting or taking the fight to them. That's pre-Trump. I think it happened before that. This idea that young men, especially young white men, need to or are tired of being attacked, perhaps, but that there is some sort of fight in them that they have to display, and they try to tie it to, I don't know, medieval times or some other idea of manhood. But to be honest with you, I think that the manhood that your father and you and others kind of portrayed, I think would be made fun of by these people, because it is not this kind of physical manifestation of greatness, because it's more of an intellectual one, if you want to say that, or like myself, right? Or fitting into a category of thing. I write about in the book the moment where a guy named John Eldredge writes a manhood book in the early 2000s.
Sure.
And there are traces or evidence of this kind of fight, of this manliness that gets exaggerated or overblown by Charlie Kirk's manhood summits that he has with Turning Point USA. It's militaristic, it's not individualistic, it's nationalistic. So they take this kind of thing that was already happening and expand it to their own goals. And I think it kind of happened early 2000s when Lance Wano met Lauren Cunningham, but around that time, the spiritual warfare thing kicks into place, and now it's about men defending the country. And certainly then it's perhaps defending some women, but not all.
Yeah. So let me ask you to open your book to chapter, I believe it's 7, where, if I remember rightly, the left can't meme.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And you sort of in chapter 7 break down the various areas. And before we get into some of the personalities like Rousseff Rushdoony and a bit more about my father and others, why don't you just flip pages and take us through reclaiming sports for Christ, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all this stuff, and just talk about the scope of what they would like to do in terms of this movement, and then maybe help us see how that goes into Project 2025, how that goes into Trump's appeal to these people. He could care less about any of this stuff. He doesn't care about, making America Christian. But what is he using? Pop culture and cultural sickness. Take us through this chapter, because it's kind of.
So this chapter is the last one. It's the mountain of entertainment. So anything that is not news related, because news has its own chapter, but the idea of taking entertainment and specific areas of entertainment and not just making a Christian parallel version of that.
Yeah.
Not just setting up your own Christian culture, but using your culture to attack the culture you don't like, or the demonized culture you think is run by Satan. So
let me just interject something there, because Trump has used some of that in the sense that he's attacked the media. He's gotten some late night hosts fired.
Right.
There's a connection with that.
Certainly. Yeah. So he doesn't like humor directed at himself, much like Turning Point doesn't like humor directed at itself. So there are sections here specifically on sports, and we've seen this obviously in the last few years, especially in the first administration, about the kneeling and the national anthem. But now the sports has become a much more, not just partisan or divided thing, but that particularly athletes are being encouraged to choose sides. We have athletes showing up at the White House and being chummy with Trump, but also saying things during interviews and things like that. So reclaiming sports for Christ meant that the liberal politics they didn't want to happen in sports. They wanted sports to be neutral, but where they really wanted, of course, was people to be silent during sports so their message could get across. And I think that's the whole mountain of entertainment idea, is that if we can silence or shame or put down your other side so you won't speak in our democracy, our sports message or our entertainment message will get across. And I think that comes clearly with Benny Johnson and the memification of entertainment. So Benny Johnson has his own show now on different networks, but he worked for Turning Point for a while as their chief creative officer. And he spread the idea of creating memes as an attack. And memes are this kind of, digital photograph or digital video. He teaches people how to do this. He does short video content. It is really about rapid response on the internet and making the internet response the most important part. And I think what he, in the section about Benny Johnson, it is making liberals cry, mocking anything that they do, making sure that they can't speak or their content doesn't rage on the internet, and making sure that you win the culture war that's happening on the internet. Now,
Can
the
I just
internet is
ask you
not.
one thing that applies to a lot of these areas, and I wanted your general opinion on it. It seems to me coming out of even what I called in those days the God cash business.
Hmm.
People sometimes say to me, well, you knew Jerry Falwell and these other people, were they sincere? And I said, well, however they began, they ended up as very good business people and got extraordinarily rich, including
Right.
Pat Robertson became an actual billionaire and owned a diamond mine in South Africa. I mean, that's a long way from $25 a month from Social Security recipients to help your TV
Yeah.
thing go.
Yeah.
But
And
when I look at Charlie Kirk and these other guys and his widow now, as she's building herself into a figure, I can't but remember that one of the reasons I hesitated in getting out of the God Cash business was the God Cash. It was my income.
mm,
So when I look at all these things, I don't take them all at face value as an
right.
ideological statement. I also say that, a lot of these people, this shtick is their way of making money. It's the same with the manosphere. It's
Mhm.
about the Bugatti and the car you buy. Thinking of Tate and these other guys, Andrew Tate. So I'm asking you, off the top of your head, when you look at an Oz Guinness on the more serious side, all the way through to these people doing memes online, don't you think that a lot of this is just fleecing the flock because you can get, clickbait, do your thing,
Mm.
make money? I always ask this about people who earn their living from the past trip, for instance, and that is, if it would you still be believing and saying the same things if this wasn't attached to a paycheck?
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
we can all ask ourselves that, whether we write
Yeah.
books or whatever it may be. But in the case of the people with their online shtick, I look at it with a very jaundiced eye in the same way that I look at JD Vance and I say, I know he knows that Trump is
Right.
lying. And I know
It's an
he's
opposite.
lying
Yeah.
when he lies about him.
Right.
He just wants the power. So
Mhm.
that's a long way of saying, what do you think the real motivation is for this movement here, aside from the ideology you cover in your
Yeah.
book, which
Right.
I
I
take,
think that, I mean, the question always comes up, is Charlie Kirk a grifter? And I see grifting as someone who does not believe in what it is they're doing. They're doing it for fake
right.
reasons, but they're doing it for money. Charlie Kirk's made a lot of money, and his wife, of course, is making more money. I think that I would not describe him as a grifter, but I would describe him as a sycophant for Trump, and that gets him a lot of money.
Sure.
Because, as you point out, J.D. Vance has said the opposite of what he's saying now. Charlie
Yeah,
Kirk
every
said the
day,
opposite.
every
Right,
day.
right. Charlie Kirk said the opposite of what he's saying now, of remixing religion and politics. He said, I did not do that. I would not want to do that in 2019. And I think that it is about power and money. But also, I think that because you're a great example of this, you've heard all this stuff before. I heard all this stuff before in the 90s. And now Charlie Kirk is repeating it to a new generation of people who either claim not to hear it before or didn't understand it. He is repeating the same shtick
Yeah, sure.
that
And
made
we've heard
plenty of
it
people
all.
money before.
Yeah.
So it that to me is what is astounding about this, that people seem not to remember all this is said before and didn't work before, and he's just raising the level of stakes on this to make more money.
Yeah.
This like he's repeating the same thing we've heard before.
Well, also there's another aspect. So what I would say the other chapter of this little book that we've just written together here is to let people know that not only has this all been said before and it's recycled,
Mhm.
but all these types of leaders have failed before.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
They all turned into millionaire grifters. They're all
Yeah.
flakes. Look
Mhm.
at look at Pat Robertson. Look at what he did finally and the money they made. But more than that, look at Liberty University and the
Yeah. Oh,
sons of Jerry Falwell. These are the
yeah.
most corrupt group of people, sexual license, stealing, corruption. You can't picture anything worse than this. And it's like Trump and Kushner and all these other guys. So it's not only the alternative being offered by the religious right and the Christian nationalist is a false alternative. They're just recycling Rushdoony, Francis Schaeffer, whomever, and taking it a step further. But their alternative world, in the best of all worlds, if Project 2025 succeeds, the people who are then in charge are liars, cheats, thieves. It's all J.D. Vance all the way down, a guy who will say anything for power. So it's not like they have some great, wonderful program. And here are the 500 key people in the Senate and the House and the government who will do this.
Right.
It's corruption and lies all the way down in terms of the people they're offering as alternatives.
Yeah, and I think that the way in which people have promoted Trump and he can do what he wants, but he is the divine figure, like that is just a cover for what you just said, right?
Yeah.
He is not the divine figure that he should be able to do what he wants and also lead us to the promised land, because he's not leading us to the promised land. It's not
No.
working in the same manner. Yeah. And I think that I mentioned in the book that, Project 2025 is just one of the 7 mountains. So Turning Point to the 7 Mountains Mandate is taking on the culture, trying to take back the culture by saying the same things, but also suggesting that they're succeeding because they find some avenue that's a little bit further down the line than what you or your father did. But it can't be called succeeding.
Well, and then there's a level of insanity to it. The other day I went to my dermatologist on a 6-month follow-up because I'd had some skin cancer and surgeries, and it's all working out fine, but he keeps an eye on me. Every time I go back, we become friends. And so, I'm sitting there naked on the side of a bench that he's been checking my whole body. And we're talking about his research projects at Harvard into melanoma that will kill you, that are being curtailed by the funding cuts by
Wow.
Kennedy and these other idiots.
Yeah.
And
Oh
so,
no. Well aware.
not only does it not play out because of these people, the serious people in our country who, by the way, kept me alive last year with a complicated cancer surgery on my face, are being denigrated by fools that these fools have brought in. Only in a world in which, Christian nationalism is taken seriously. I know this sounds odd. Could you have Kennedy in charge of our healthcare system? I grew up in an anti-science family. Go to the Bible. So they were primed for this bullshit. Now
Yeah.
we have measles. Now my dermatologist, project
Yeah.
is being cut. The one that saved my life.
Yes. I know measles. Totally.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I
It is.
mean,
It's
so
crazy.
the whole thing, it falls apart on the evidentiary basis of what's actually out there. This is what drives me crazy.
Yeah, no, I saw a poll just this week that the question was, is Trump acting ethically in office? Uh, Evangelicals were like, yes, 40% of them said yes. And I'm like,
Wonderful.
are you, what?
Who do you know who died of measles last week? And do you really want to die of skin cancer because the research at Harvard's been cut because Trump decides he's against the universities because J.D. Vance has an ideological point to push in order to get the votes of idiots? I mean, how far do you want to go down this path?
Yes, indeed. Lots of craziness. And I guess the question I also often get is like, how do we stop this? And I
Yeah.
go, well, I mean, it takes some persuasion, but at the same time, these people are not necessarily going to change their mind. They're not going to be detransitioned into something else. They're still going to be like the way they are.
So let's go back to chapter 7. I interrupted you about a third of the way through the recap.
It's all right. So we talked about memes and the sports thing. The other section was about pop culture, and there's a woman named Alex Clark who had a pop culture show on Turning Point. And really, what was fascinating to me about that was it was both to mock pop culture, if you will, normal pop culture, but also try to set up their own version of that. The Turning Point has a daily show that mocks the Daily Show. They have a news organization called Frontlines, and they try to do pop culture, not just to have their own thing, but to mock the other thing, which is fascinating because Alex Clark said at some point, I don't want to do this anymore. That I'm getting sick of this whole pop culture thing. And she started the Maha movement in part with Robert Kennedy. That she's the face of that movement because she's trying to cure a sickness in culture that she helped promote because of Turning Point. I mean, that was just the most fascinating thing to me.
Let me get into the book now, as we should. I want you to just open your book and flip through the chapter headings and give me a summary that I could, because by the way, I've read your book twice now, once to prepare for the thing we didn't do, and again to refresh me. This morning, I get up at 3 o'clock, I read the file again, I made notes. I'm tempted to show off, but instead of doing that, I've got the author sitting here. So I want you to just flip the chapter headings. Give us, I want to do 2 things before we get close to wrapping up here. And I'm 73, so you can remember if I can. I want you to go through the chapter headings and tell us what's in the book. And then I want you to go back through the book again and tell us who the key players were. And once in a while, I'll digress. When you talk about Rushdoony, I'll talk about how crazy he was because I knew him well. Let's do those 2 things before we get near wrapping up.
Sure. So there are 7 chapters with the introduction, each of them devoted to one of the mountains. So the first chapter is the Mountain of Education. It's entitled God's 1776 Project. And this relates to both the rise of voucher money the attack on public schools, but also the rise of Hillsdale College in Michigan, which intends to promote Christian nationalism agenda and curriculum through public schools. And so the idea was that as Christians left public schools and started their own private schools, now Charlie Kirk and his generation are going back into public schools to make them into patriotic academies. They want to take back public schools, not just remove themselves from it. And there's also, of course, a section on higher education in this chapter. The professor watch list, as I mentioned, and I'm on that. There are 1,000 people on that. There's a school board watch list now. And then the central, characters in that Mountain of Education book is a guy named Hertzberger, if I ever say his name correctly. He is the head of Turning Point Education. He worked a long time with Erwin Lutzer up in Chicago as the executive pastor there. And now he does teacher summits. He does training for students. And of course, the last thing about education is Turning Point has more high school chapters now than they do college chapters. So it is a pipeline of people that they are creating with their clubs in education. The next chapter is the Mountain of Government, and it's entitled Counselor to the King. Now, Lance Wallnau also plays a role in this, but also Charlie Kirk's mentor into the Seven Mountains is a pastor named Rob McCoy, who's now retired from the megachurch he ran in California. He's a Seven Mountains guy, and he introduced Seven Mountains to Charlie Kirk. And he convinced Charlie that one of the aspects of the Seven Mountains was that the church, conservative Christians, their theology should be the counselor to the government, not just a moral conscience like Martin Luther King would say, but it should have a powerful role in perhaps approving or denying legislation. And specifically, I talk about in this chapter, not just the federal government that changes hands often, but the state governments and where Turning Point is trying to move red states even more redder than they are now. There's a group called City Elders, which wants to have the church and its elders run cities. Mm-hmm. And lastly, I think that in this chapter, the main person is Rob McCoy, but also should mention Shay On, who was one of the faces of the New Apostolic Reformation. He is running for governor of California. He is this charismatic, not just small c, but theological charismatic thinker who made a speech on January 5th, who was part of Trump's evangelical advisory board. And he is suggesting, of course, that the government should be Christian and that the church should act like a sort of city council, sort of command center to run the government.
Can I ask you one wise man question? And then forgive me, I do not want to interrupt you. So go back where I pick right up. But it seems to me that in my lifetime, and I think you were born early enough too, to know what I'm talking about. Back in the day, one of the things that would have seemed impossible in the present framework was that charismatic, off-the-wall, Pentecostal, tongue-speaking, healing Christian types would be working with sober evangelical, Francis Schaeffer follower types. That would have been just as unlikely as a collaboration between conservative Roman Catholics and evangelicals to get Trump. So just go to that tiny footnote for, first of all, talk about the change, but also talk about how do these guys sit in the same room with each other when basically they hate each other's theology?
Yeah, I kind of mentioned that, as you say, with R.J. Drostuni's line of thinking here and his theonomy. Parallel to that was this rise of charismatic Seven Mountains people. They sometimes overlapped in the 80s, 90s, as you're well aware, but they did not share the same ideas.
No, not at all.
And I think what brought them together was this idea that we should not have enemies to our right, or we should not have enemies in our own camp. They forgot their disagreements over the end times. They forgot the theological disagreements. And really, when evangelicals started to be a center in politics in the 80s, they said, we need to work together.
Yeah.
And I think that has really kind of melded the differences between the two. There's polling that I talk about in this book that 30 to 40% of Americans would agree with elements of the Seven Mountains mandate. And it has taken over the Republican Party, all elements of the Republican Party in many ways, because it's become the organizing element to reach everybody, not just religious people. And I think that's the idea, that the more they work together, their differences went away. And Charlie Kirk often says that he does not want to talk about the differences. He wanted to talk about what unites them.
Yeah, they want to win on the political front and to hell with the theology, which is a reverse, because it used to be the theology mattered and politics was secondary.
Certainly. So the third chapter then brings us to theology. It's the mountain of religion. It's called biblical citizenship. And this idea has been around for quite a while, is that you're training in churches people to be citizens, which is not a bad thing. You
Right.
train them to pay attention to school boards and pay attention to city councils. But this idea of biblical citizenship is that you should not just participate or not just try to influence, but that you should, when you become elected from your church or from your local area, because it's a minority movement on purpose, you should then institute God's will to the rest of us from
Yeah.
your position of power. And this is really the idea behind the seven mountains. I do think the mountain of religion is pretty obviously the most important one.
Sure.
Is that it's a minority movement on purpose. It's about taking the high places. But what I also point out in this chapter is, like, to me, the irony, the mountain of religion, right? Churches, I mean, Christians run churches. How is this a demonic mountain run by satanic forces? And I think what I don't know, genius, if you want to call that, of Lance Wallnau or Peter, the NAR and people before him, is they attacked churches because they said they weren't doing enough. They specifically
Sure. And,
attacked
and if you read some of the books that we've covered here by people who are still evangelicals within the movement, but who lament this direction, they lament the fact that so many pastors are being attacked by their congregations for not being radical enough, and then they're having to move along or lose their jobs.
Yes, no, yeah. And that's exactly the divide that Charlie Kirk has furthered. He does pastor summits where he says, if you don't talk about politics in your pulpit, you're a coward.
Yeah.
I can't be more precise than that. That's the word he uses. So the next chapter is the mountain of family. It's entitled The Masculine Heart and the Feminine Mystique. And I referred to this earlier, and the change of what it means to be a man or manhood from the early 2000s to now. But really, the mountain of family is about obviously defining the traditional family and silencing and shaming and attacking those that did not meet that definition. But really, it's about setting up this nationalist idea of the roles of men and women. So we see this in Pete Hegseth and the Department of War and military, that men are should defend the nation and women should defend the home.
Right.
And that obviously implies no jobs and nothing outside the home, but also the mountain of family is about taking this idea, and that's usually implanted in churches, and spreading it nationwide.
Okay, so I want to interrupt you there and get your thoughts on this and get back to your subject after I'm done interrupting you. But I have to go here. How do you account for, and I know this is, sort of a question and sort of a comment, but I want your opinion on this. One of the things that has struck me recently is how the pro-life movement became the litmus test that got a lot of these folks elected. Okay, we agree. All right. And now we have the people funding the movement obliquely, like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk. Musk, who's had about 15 kids with 6 to 7 different women by in vitro fertilization, where the embryos are tested genetically. The unfit embryos are discarded, which is exactly the opposite of everything the pro-life movement stands for. Peter Thiel with fertility clinics that he wants to live forever, blood transfusions from children, all these crazy ideas. And then Hegseth, married 3 times, getting women pregnant he's not married to, an adulterous alcoholic. And again, if I was looking at my evangelical friends in the 1970s and saying, this is who will become your people. All right, I'll give you a pass. Donald Trump was brought to us by God. They grabbed them by the pussy. Okay, he's a bad king. What about all these other guys who are funding the movement? What about the tens of millions of dollars that Thiel's putting into it so he doesn't have his companies like Palantir and other things regulated? Who's Elon Musk in this Christian demonic war for true manhood and fatherhood and family? Help me understand that, because, okay, Trump, I don't buy, but I get the thinking. He's this bad king. Who are these other guys? And how is everything that my father and Dr. Koop predicted that would happen to the secular culture in embryo selection and all the rest is now being funded by the guys who were funding the religious resurgence, because they can use it because they don't want to be regulated. So they want Republicans in office. And yet, not just in their personal lives, a little adultery, a little divorce, but in their actual technological innovations, they're innovating a genuine 1984 Brave New World, Animal Farm world that Coop and Dad predicted as their worst case scenario unless we reversed Roe.
Mm. I think there's an underlying theme in the book I tried to make clear, but like the people like the reason Lauren Cunningham mentions your father is because he wanted his list attached to someone who had much bigger platform. Lauren and Bill Bright were kind of known, of course, as those two people, but your father had a stratospheric platform. They attached their project to his name because they wanted it to spread. I think it's the same thing that's going on with all the people that you mentioned and the conservative evangelicals that support them or take their money. Is they have much more stratospheric platform, of course, much more money, and they're allowing them to say what they want to say, so evangelicals can attach their coattails or the coattails of these people to them. If they want to be in that crowd, and if they get culture on them and secular culture on them, it won't hurt them that much. This goes back to, I think, what your father said, the idea of culture invading the church, and it always kills the church. I think the evangelicals attach themselves to all the people you just said. They don't care about that anymore because they not just want to win, but they see the power that they could have now after even overturning Roe v. Wade. It's like that happened, but where do they go from there? They didn't back and say, oh, we have society now. They went further and further up the ladder to all these people, if that makes sense to me.
Yeah, and then we'll get back to your subject, which is chapters, but one more thing. In the best of all worlds, what is the end game? I always wanted Roe reversed when I was a pro-life activist, and that happened. What is the end game of this entire movement in terms of, in the best of all worlds, what kind of people are in charge, and what sort of a country are we living in?
Sometimes I answer that question was obviously they want a Christian nation, they want church to run it. It's like the Puritans early on in Massachusetts. Sometimes I also answer they have no idea. Like they have a sense of kind of, this thing, but the particulars always escape them. Or like, when did we lose this Christian nation? Was that in the 60s? Was that some other time? They're always unclear about that. I think many people don't have any idea. They just want it to happen.
How about
And
the
so
revenge motive? They just want to sort of stick it to whoever they don't
right,
like.
yeah. So they just want it to happen, and they don't really care who actually is in charge when it happens because they know that the people they hate won't be in charge.
Yeah, okay. Back to your chapters.
Okay. So we did the Mountain of Family. The feminine mystique obviously refers to Betty Friedan, but it was also this idea that, as Alice Clark and Erica Kirk have talked about, they're redefining femininity and, womanhood and wife material. As Charlie Kirk said, it's about going to college and getting your MRS degree, but it is also about supporting your husband in every way that you can think of.
So once again, sorry to whip a dead horse, but how do they then justify that the major funder of the Christian nationalist movement obliquely through funding the Republican Party is Elon Musk, who is impregnating various women all over the country through in vitro fertilization and setting them up to raise these children by nannies, the exact opposite of everything they envision as femininity in the women he's coercing into this. Again, you heard anybody, I just am asking, it's a serious question. Have you heard anybody on the right saying, what are we taking money and influence from this guy for? When his whole life is a denial of everything we're talking about in terms of who women are, who men are supposed to be. I mean, what gives there? Because it's not just hypocrisy. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars are being put into this movement by this man.
Right.
Who individually is further from them than even Donald Trump is. Donald Trump sort of was serial monogamist. He only abused one woman at a time. He didn't have a network of people out there trolling for the next girl to get pregnant.
Right. Yeah. No, I've not heard any defense of Elon Musk on a moral case or an immoral case. They just like his money or they like his effects. But I also think that it goes back to, I think with the section I read was this line of despair that your father talked about. Like, the people that are conservative evangelicals and want Elon's money, they don't want to think about what he's doing because that would just send them, their double thoughts or their double-mindedness would just break them apart.
What about the thinking that goes this way? What they're doing by keeping Republicans in power who won't regulate him or Peter Thiel or these other guys, they're actually enabling him. Because Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and the other tech bros are counting not just on moral hypocrisy about their marriages and affairs and fooling around. They're counting on the Republican Party staying in power, so they are not regulated. They're going to get their pound of flesh.
Yeah, totally. It's like the Doge thing, right? They celebrated this eliminating of all this fraud and waste and abuse, but what did Elon get out of it? Everybody's social security number. He got what he wanted out of it.
Yeah. Yes. Okay, so back to your book.
So chapter 5 is the mountain of business, marketplace apostles in God's economy. Now, marketplace apostles is a phrase used by the New Apostolic Reformation, and their idea is that rich businessmen should be labeled apostles, that they should use their money for God's kingdom. They should make money for it to be used for God's kingdom. And of course, God's kingdom and God's economy is free market capitalism here. So I'm trying to get into the history of social conservatism and capitalism, why the two go together. The central character, though, I think in this chapter, beyond the history of it, is Candace Owens. Yeah. And if you don't know who Candace Owens is, she used to work for Turning Point, and now she has her own show, and she has had many shows, and she goes where the money is. But I really think that her origin story of my grandfather grew up on a farm as a sharecropper, and now he owns it. I was victimized in high school and college because I was Black, and now I'm going to be an entrepreneur. And really, that entrepreneur part is what she has become, and part of that is the prosperity gospel. Is that
and the prosperity gospel fits perfectly with grifters of all types.
Yeah. Right,
my old friend, the DeVos family and Amway, it was a family. They were building a Ponzi scheme, and it was all about Christianity and vitamin supplements and God knows what. And this, again, I've seen it all before. You just change name, Candace Owens. She just reminds me of, the DeVos fan and so forth and so on. This is the same old musical chairs game.
Right. Yeah. Which is fascinating in this particular chapter, though, is to not just see that repeat thing, but how people dismiss the signs they currently see. So we write about why Candace Owens left Turning Point and her pro-Hitler rhetoric and her anti-Israel rhetoric, all the things that she's saying now, she was saying those years ago.
Sure.
And for Turning Point to dismiss her was really a key moment in not just Turning Point, but for Candace. And so then the question becomes, what does Charlie think about all this, and why does Turning Point turn into a pro-white organization? He talks about a war on white people. He talks about all these different things. And I think because that's where the money was.
Yeah.
Charlie Kirk had a organization that was libertarian, conservative. Trump was in his corner. And then he moved into Christian nationalism, mainly because Rob McCoy opened up doors for him. And I think convinced him, not just theologically, this was a good idea, but this was a great business opportunity. And so he, 2020 came, colleges were shut down. He went to all these churches and gave this message to them.
Yeah, and I would just interject for people who are listening. And by the way, this will be our book club. Hold your book up again and do the title.
Yes, The Seven Mountains Mandate, Exposing the Dangerous Plan to Christianize America and Destroy Democracy.
Right, and this is going to be our book club offering in July. And I just want to interject, we're listening to Charlie Kirk and he was killed and so forth, but the book, far from being dated, is a map to an entire movement, and the names are all interchangeable. It could have been Jack Smith and not Charlie Kirk. The book's about him. The book is about the anatomy of the grift of the right, which is going to result in our losing our democracy because it's being manipulated by a billionaire class that doesn't care about any of these issues or live according to any of these precepts. But they want to keep the Republicans in power because they don't want to be regulated. That's Peter Thiel all the way down. And Peter Thiel's weird in this. Genuinely, I think you look at his mental issues. He doesn't want to die. He said so, and he thinks somehow high tech will enable him to come up with ways to live forever or a very long time. And so there's all these weird motivations amongst the billionaires: greed, money, power. But the fact of the matter is, I just want to introduce the idea to you here and hear your reaction to it again, that the biggest game afoot is that the religious right became Christian nationalist movement, but the Christian nationalist movement has become the servant of the tech billionaires.
Yeah, I did a podcast with Mike Madrid several weeks ago about this idea that the Silicon Valley people and the Christian nationalist people were coming together, and of course they meet in dance. Yeah, they meet in
each thinks they're using the other.
Right. And so back to the coattails thing, I really do think the Christian nationalists, the people that run the Seven Mountains, they want to be a part of something that they think is bigger than them, more power, more money, and that's the Silicon Valley people.
Well, good luck letting those guys. You will not get get within sniffing distance of their
Yeah.
parking garage once they
Yeah.
sit in power.
Yeah. This is like, Trump going to his own club and having the red velvet rope around him, all the people that paid to watch him and watch him eat his own dinner.
Back to
Yeah.
your book.
So I do mention Pat Robertson in the Mountain of Business chapter, because not just of all the money that he made, but at some point he did talk about greed being bad, but that people have ignored that for decades now. So chapter 6 is the Mountain of Media. What's really happening is the title here. And the idea, of course, is that not just attacks on fake news or attacks on mainstream media, but that conspiracy is the wheel that turns the Seven Mountains Mandate. It itself is a conspiracy because the demonic and controlling our culture, but that conspiracy, particularly in media. And I grew up, I don't know, sometimes watching a guy named Jack Van Impe, who I think you might recognize.
I know him.
Right. So he would sit in front of the TV and tell us weekly, here's all the events that are happening around the world, and here are the exact Bible verses that says this is why it's happening, or this is it's supposed to happen. And his wife would go, wow, that's amazing.
And my lowest moment as an evangelical activist was to agree to go on his show and sit there and listen to his bullshit, knowing full well he was an absolute madman, and nod and pray along through it because I was part of the deal.
So with that idea that I'm telling you the truth and nobody else is, that is the Seven Mountains Mandate idea.
Sure.
There's this conspiracy going on, and only you can see it if you believe enough. And of course, each new conspiracy has to be created to have this bigger conspiracy at work. So I go through a couple of different conspiracies that Turning Point has pushed forward, not just election fraud, but other ones. And this idea that I am telling you the truth, and you're getting it from nowhere else. You're not getting it from mainstream media. That's really the idea behind the Mountain of Media.
And by the way, and it was the idea when I was a kid, and my mother was telling me, don't believe anything they're telling you in school when you go to British private school if they study biology and talk about evolution, because we believe in Genesis, and that's true. So I was groomed to be of that mindset, and then it's applied to politics. They're lying, and only your mother's telling you the truth. Well, they're lying, and only Trump is telling you the truth.
Indeed, indeed. So there are several Turning Point characters in this chapter, Jack Posevich being one of them, but really Charlie Kirk is a big one there. But also I want to tie the idea back to Jerry Falwell. I mentioned, back in the 80s, it was to me about creating your own separate Christian culture, your own separate Christian media, for example. But now it is about taking over the media that's existed. And we see that going on, of course, with all the rich people you just mentioned, with CBS and possibly.
And Trump's buddies buying into the companies that control the networks and the movie studios, a literal conspiracy to take over the media from their point of view, so other points of views will not be expressed. And we're only in the first year of this presidency.
So the last chapter we've already mentioned is the Mountain of Entertainment. I won't spend too much time on that, but it is about cultural warfare in the entertainment area, memes, sports, any type of non-news area you can think of. But also I think that because, as I mentioned, Biddy Johnson as this example of this, I also want to mention the what's happening at the Pentagon. So you have all these regular, really good reporters and mainstream media people kicked out of the Pentagon, and who do they invite in? All these other far-right people. Turning Point has a Pentagon correspondent. They have a White House correspondent. It is about them presenting the picture to their audiences, really to the nation, about the greatness of our government and our leader. So it is about messaging. It is about framing that, but it is also about attacking the media and downplaying its independence. And for me,
it's become a mirror image of Putin's Russia in the way he deals with the war in Ukraine.
Think about Fox News been doing this for decades. What they're doing now is even more so. That's because it's niche audience, because they're not just doing it for the ratings; they're doing it for the power in the government.
Yeah, and the thing is, and this is a genuine question, not a rhetorical question. It seems to me that at a certain point, the lies fail when they fail so spectacularly that the edifice crumbles quicker than people would have thought. And I'll give you an example. Should this whole war with Iran really go south, and if we're really stuck, or the economy or some other aspect of it, at a certain point, people look up and they just lose faith in the system in its entirety, which doesn't mean they'll vote for Democrats.
Right.
But I think the next step for our country is one of deep cynicism because there will be more and more people on the right who, whether they admit it or not, know not only have they been failed, but they have been lied to, and they know they went along with the lie. And of course, we'll see if JD Vance ever gets elected, because he has lied for the liar and
Right.
pretended to go along with it. And I think the same thing with Peter Thiel and Elon Musk and these other guys. They know that when they stood up with Trump, that they were taking their lives in their hands, because in the end, for the economy, for our military, Pete Hegseth beating his chest and saying, we're bringing silent death and all this. This doesn't play very well anyway with a lot of Americans. And then on top of that, if you're losing, and these big, well-laid plans fail massively, what do you think will happen? Because I don't think this has a happy ending.
No, no. And so the question to me that I always get asked is what do we do with the MAGA crowd after Trump leaves the political scene, when he's no longer the central character, or when he's no longer president, or whatever it is? And whether JD Vance wins or not is still the question. And I do think that the turning point is trying to be that place where they go after that. But also, will any of them change their minds? I don't necessarily think so. And so they won't necessarily, as you say, vote Democrat. They'll just fade back into what they were before, not participating perhaps. I think that they've realized, especially with the Epstein files, that they've been lied to. And there are moments where they start to see that. And so a cynical, we'll say, electorate is to me much more dangerous than perhaps the divided electorate we have now. And so that gets the question of violence. The question of, we've had several assassinations, not just Charlie Kirk's in the last few years, is what do you do with that cynicism? What do you do with that I've been lied to? What do you do with that hatred now of not just one side, but all sides? I think that is a difficult, and this is why the question of destroying democracy comes up. It's not just the anti-democratic movement that is this book. They're creating a crowd that they will say cannot control. They don't know the outcome. They're not going to win the culture war. The culture war is for fighting, as you well know. So the idea of, like, we're never going to win this thing, and so at some point the rhetorical violence becomes physical violence. That's where I think we're going. I don't know when that happens. Maybe another lost election, maybe another insurrection. Maybe it's after Trump leaves the scene. But the Seven Mountains Mandate is based on the idea that we're going to have a Christian nation. We're going to make this glorious nation for Christ to return. I don't think that's
none of it's going to happen. And then where does that leave all the people who have dedicated their lives to it and also happen to be well armed?
No doubt, no doubt. Charlie Kirk got a question several years ago at an event in Idaho, where Doug Wilson works. But the question, from this guy was like, when do we get to use the guns? This was during the Biden administration. So Charlie said, don't do it now. The government will just take you down. But there's a reason he got that question.
Well, and the groundwork for that was laid by my dad, saying, unless Roe v. Wade is reversed democratically, at a certain point, we have to look at what would have been appropriate to overthrow Hitler. And of course, the inference was, not just insurrection, but armed conflict. So it's been in the air, and my family was something to do with that. But, my verdict is, it's not just lies about international policy and the economy. You've got, I think one of the Trump people, politics in general, they never seem to factor in unforeseen consequences. And the unforeseen consequences of a massive measles epidemic, of people my age not being able to get an updated flu shot this autumn because research was canceled. This has a snowball effect of where you live, seeing ICE agents armed and masked in airports when all you want to do is check in with your grandchildren for a trip to Disney World. At a certain point, the ragged edge of Trump's, autocratic rule and the chaos is going to bump up against people in unforeseen ways. And I think at that point, no one's going to be thanking these evangelical ministers and Pentecostal ministers who have pushed us in that direction by giving voters to this agenda.
If you think about the Seven Mountains, this cultural institutions that they want to take over, there's seven of them. The answer has to also to be, the response to this has to also be, we also have to participate in these seven areas. As you point out, that there's so much chaos in all of these areas. At some point, all of it kind of falls. What do we do then? We have to go back to these areas.
And we have to do what you and I are doing here today in promoting your book, because when I find a project that I think actually tells something true about something vital, we do what we can. So that's it. People have got to do that.
Yeah,
So
indeed.
come July, it's on our book club. But before that, hold it up one more time. Let's
One
promote
more
it.
time.
The Seven Mountains
Yeah.
Mandate and the subtitle again.
Exposing the dangerous plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy.
Okay, well, we didn't get into Rushdoony, but we did cover what your book is about. And of course, if people want to know who all the players were, it's in your book. But the big story
There's
of
a great timeline at the beginning of the book that the publisher thought was a good idea. So you can see it in chronological order with Rushdoony in his book in 73.
Exactly. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a favor. When I sign off here, would you please stay and talk to my producer, Ernie Gregg, about
Sure.
two things. One, to make sure we coordinate with you as best as possible to send people toward your book when we do it as a book club. And secondly, who else ought we to be talking to?
Okay.
Because some of our best guests come from suggestions from our guests.
Yeah.
So if
Sure.
you would do that. And listen, I just can't thank you enough for writing this book. It's a really important book, and you cannot really understand the world we're in right now unless you read the book. So that's my endorsement.
That is high praise coming from you. Thank you
I
very much.
really mean it. And I was a fly on the wall, knew the guys you're talking about. And like I said, you are accurate and 100% there. So from the bits where I experienced part of your book in real time, I can tell people that I trust this book entirely.
Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and all the best. And talk to Ernie, please.
Yeah.
Thank you for your time.